Hey, Cookies here. This is the Mythic Plus Quickstart guide for Discipline Priest. So we will just jump right into the talents. Here's a TLDR of what talents you'd want to run in M+, so you can skip ahead if you don't care about the descriptions or me talking about other talents that you could possibly run. But going into the actual talent tree itself, in the first row, the two choices that you mostly have is Twist of Fate and Schism. Twist of Fate is going to provide you more healing output, and you essentially would take this in higher keys where it's going to proc a lot, and you can usually just check. The best way is run a dungeon and then check either on details or on Warcraft logs for the buff uptime of Twist of Fate on yourself, and you would generally want it somewhere in like the range of like 50% or higher uptime. Maybe a little less. It depends on the dungeon because of combat time and all that kind of stuff, but in active combat, you want this active about 50% of the time for it to be really like useful. And then Schism, I usually run this on like lower keys where I feel confident that I don't need the extra healing from Twist of Fate or anything like that on specific bosses and stuff. And Schism just provides us with more damage throughout the dungeon. It's a very little amount of damage, but it still is more damage than if you're running Twist of Fate. So in the 25 talent row, it doesn't really matter what you take here. You can take Masochism if you want an extra damage reduction for yourself. So if you're fighting specific bosses where you feel like you're in danger of dying without extra damage reduction, then Masochism is really, really good. The thing that comes to mind when I think about this is the last boss of Spires of Ascension on Tyrannical Weeks, because that like big AoE that the boss does hits very, very, very hard. So having a little bit of extra damage reduction can be really useful. But otherwise, Angelic Feather just has like the most versatility in being something that provides us with movement speed, and not only us, but other players like the tank and stuff, which can be very useful. In the 30 talent row, typically you would only take Power Word Solace here. It just is free damage, free healing on one global. The other spells just are passives that benefit other spells that we already have, where Power Word Solace actually gives us a new spell to play with. Mindbender can be useful in M+, if you feel like you need more, like a shorter cooldown, because Shadow Fiend is more powerful if you don't have Mindbender, but it's a longer cooldown. So Shadow Fiend is normally 3 minutes. This makes Shadow Fiend 1 minute, but it makes it a weaker Shadow Fiend. So if you feel like you need that kind of like every pull you want like a mini Shadow Fiend versus on bosses or really hard pulls you want a big Shadow Fiend, then Mindbender can be actually pretty good. I will mention it right now on Conduits. If you take Mindbender, always make sure you take the Rabid Shadows Conduit, which is actually a Shadow Priest Conduit. But you need to run this if you're going to run Mindbender ever, because it's like the only way that it makes it in line with Power Word Solace. In the 35 talent row, Psychic Voice or Shining Force are both really good. Dominant Mind doesn't have any uses whatsoever. But Psychic Voice is a great AoE interrupt, or like kind of AoE disorient, to stop things from casting, because it reduces the cooldown of Psychic Scream, so we can just use it more often. And then Shining Force gives us a really powerful knockback for either specific dungeons or specific weeks like Sanguine and stuff like that, or Spiteful. And then in the 40 talent row, Sins of the Mini is the go-to. This is because it just increases our damage done throughout the whole dungeon by quite a lot. Especially because we're not in a raid, so the damage reduction or the reduced amount of damage that we're getting from this talent is not nearly as like bad as it is in raid, in terms of how like low the damage gain gets, because it can only go down a certain amount because we only have 5 targets that we can affect with atonements. Contrition can be good if you really feel like you need extra healing, and if you're going to be using penance defensively on people. So if you're struggling on like AoE healing fights or something like that, Contrition can be really good. And also Shadow Covenant is usually the go-to talent if you feel like you need more healing output rather than damage. So if you're struggling on bosses or specific pulls where you feel like just the group's falling apart and you can't keep anybody alive, Shadow Covenant can be a nice little bump to that like sustained healing that you have in the group. On the 45 talent row, Purge the Wicked is going to always be the best choice because it just spreads our dot for us, so we don't have to spend as many globals, and it also does a lot more damage and healing passively, especially on like single target fights and stuff like that. But again, if you feel like you need more burst healing or something like that, you can take things like Divine Star and Halo, which will help heal the group up more but do less damage. And then in the 50 talent row, you would only ever take Lenience, and that's just because it gives everybody in the group 3% damage reduction pretty much at all times when it matters, which is 3% damage reduction at all times is actually huge. It's a very, very big amount of damage reduction for things like M+, where people are getting one-shot by mechanics and stuff. So you'll pretty much never see play from Spirit Shell or Evangelism just because they do not give damage reduction. Going over Covenants and Legendaries. For Covenant, definitely always play Kyrian if you care about like doing a decent amount of damage and doing a decent amount of healing. Kyrian with double Legendary is going to be absolutely insane, and it's very, very good, and it's always been very good for Disc Priest. The other Covenants are completely viable. You can play whatever you want, but I'm going to focus on Kyrian here because that is what is the best for M+. For Legendary, you should pretty much be running one of two Legendaries. You should either be running Twins of the Sun Priest if you're in a more organized group, or you have some kind of like, I have a weak aura that tells me when certain classes are using certain cooldowns, so I use my PI correctly and I'm not wasting it or not pressing it at all. Because you obviously don't want to run this Legendary if you're just randomly throwing PI out on people and you don't really know when it's lining up with their cooldowns and stuff like that. So if you're more in like the Pug life, or you again, like don't have weak auras, like, or you don't want to use weak auras like that, or you don't want to worry about PI in the first place, or you just feel like PIing yourself sometimes, then you should run the, or in the Holy, then you should be running the Penitent one. It's also a very, or Penitent one. It's a very solid Legendary. It'll help increase your damage and your burst healing. It's a little bit RNG, so that's why it's kind of annoying to run. But again, it's better than running Twins of the Sun Priest and not fully utilizing it. So definitely run this if you just want something passive that you don't have to worry about, and that still feels good when it procs and you can notice it in terms of healing and damage. Kiss of Death, I will mention, also does have some viability, so you could play around with this one if you want like a very unique damage Legendary, and it's really fun to play with, honestly. I played it with it a little bit in Season 1, and I enjoyed it a lot, so I'll probably mess around with it again and see how it feels. So out of those, so we'll say those are the three that you would want to run in M+. Twins, Penitent one, or Kiss of Death. Kind of your choice between those three. For Soulbinds, Mechanicos always reduces the cooldown of our main Covenant ability, which is very, very important. And then for Conduits, Endurance, we have Translucent Image, Light's Inspiration, and Charitable Soul. Those are all three really, really good Endurance conduits. Condensed Animosphere is fine as well. I would say the most important ones are definitely Translucent Image and Charitable Soul, and that's because we get the most benefit out of those ones as a Disc Priest. For the Finesse conduits, Clear Mind and Power Onto Others are the two best ones to run. That's because they just offer the most utility, reduced mana cost, and reduced cooldown on PI, especially for running that PI Legendary. That is very, very good. For Potency conduits, you should pretty much always run your Covenant conduit along with Shining Radiance. If you have a third Covenant or a third conduit slot, you can run either Swift Penitence. It's very, very good. Helps increase the damage and healing of your penance just passively. Or another great one to run is Rabid Shadows if you want to do one of two things. First, if you're running Mindbender, like I mentioned previously, you will always want to run Rabid Shadows. But if you're not running Mindbender, you can still run Rabid Shadows, and it basically just will increase the potency and damage of your Shadow Fiend. So it's essentially the best way to think about Rabid Shadows is it's just going to increase your damage throughout the dungeon. So it's going to make you do more overall damage than other things. So those are the, 4 potency conduits that you would want to pick from: Rabid Shadows, Swift Penitence, Shining Radiance, and your Covenant conduit. That is it for Soulbinds and Conduits. As far as other Covenants and stuff like that goes, it really doesn't matter. They're mostly utility picks, so feel free to just pick whichever one you like the most. Mechanicos is really the only one worth talking about or mentioning that you like absolutely need to run in Mythic Plus. So stat priority. This is the last thing we'll go over for Disc Priests. As always, you should mostly just take item level, and for the most part, if you want to min-max your stats, you should just avoid mastery as much as possible. The less mastery you have, the more damage you do throughout the dungeon, and that's what really matters in Mythic Plus as a healer, is how much damage can you help contribute. But with each of the stats, we have Critical Strike, which is going to be a very good damage and very good healing stat, so crit is always good. Versatility, also a very high damage stat. It's about an average healing stat. It's not good or bad, but it does add a lot of survivability to our toolkit, which is very important because Disc Priest has a very hard time surviving mechanics and stuff like that because we lack defensive cooldowns. We do have Power Word Shield, which is very nice, but it's not a damage reduction. So versatility is very good to take. What I usually do is I'll end up, as I kind of get more item level and I get the stats I want and I get to the value of haste that I feel comfortable with, I will end up just starting to like stack crit and versatility as much as possible because it just helps with that survivability and healing aspect. And then we have Mastery, which gives us absolutely no damage, but it's a fairly good healing stat. So if you feel like you're struggling on healing, do not be afraid to take some Mastery. A lot of people are going to say, oh, Mastery is so bad because it doesn't give you damage, but what matters is completing the dungeon and, you know, timing it, which, yes, for very high keys, you're not going to want Mastery because you need to do as much damage as possible in order to time the key. But if you're doing a 15 or a 20 or a 10 or something like that, it is not going to make that much of a difference. Surviving the key is what's going to make the difference. So Mastery can be a very solid stat for healing specifically. And then lastly, we have Haste, which is going to be our highest damage stat and a pretty good healing stat. It's definitely not the best healing stat because crit and verse probably do it a little bit better, but Haste is very solid and it makes the class feel very smooth, and it's important to have a lot of haste in the first place so that we can cast spells quickly and put a lot of power word shields out and do things like that. So that covers all the stats, and with that, that is all that we have to talk about for the Quickstart Mythic Plus guide for Disc Priests. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.